All right, gentlemen, kings, everyone else, welcome to yet another exciting episode of, I don't know, just figure something out yourself. I'm not in the mood today. Anyways, I don't usually do these sort of back-to-back episodes, back-to-back things, but I saw something very interesting yesterday, and it was by Lao Y. Lao Y is a YouTuber. He's been living in China for how many years? He moved out of China. He's friends with Serpent Zere, Winston. And they talk about China. They have the China show, right? And something very interesting that caught my eye is that Lao Wai did the recent video where he says China's going to invade Russia. China's going to invade the Russian Far East, Siberia, whatever. And this is something that I've mentioned myself multiple times on this channel. I even wrote an essay about it, that essentially the biggest opportunistic enemy of Russia in the event of a weakening or collapse of the Russian Federation will be China, because China actually does claim quite a bit of Russian territory, specifically outer Manchuria. So a little history reminder there. Modern China is essentially the old territory of the Manchu Empire. I forget the Chinese name of the Manchu Empire. You've seen The Last Emperor. That's actually a very good movie. You should watch it. Just beyond just the history lesson, it's a beautiful movie. And the parts of the old empire which are not as of yet part of the People's Republic of China are Outer Manchuria and Taiwan. And the Chinese Communist Party pledged in 1948 to reverse the century of humiliation for China within 100 years. So the window is closing in 2048. That's not that far away, actually. That's 23 years away. Anyways, so this will inevitably lead to a war between China and Russia in the next 23 or so years, if China cannot peacefully take over this old territory, such as, for example, demographically displacing the Russians, which is happening to a degree in Vladivostok, right in the city of Vladivostok, and many of the cities of the Russian Far East. But I guess the fear in China right now is that if the Russians and the Americans reach détente, and given that the White House, that the Oval Office is now occupied by a Russian agent, by a Russian asset, this is actually very likely. So the Chinese are probably thinking, okay, we got to act fast before the Americans can put the infrastructure in place to actually stand on the Russian side. And Lao Wai reasons that, the Chinese may hit the Russian Far East. And this would give the Chinese a very good position to actually break out from their encirclement. So, a little geography lesson now. The Asian landmass is bounded in its entirety on the eastern side, right? So, to the east of Asia, there is what is called a chain of islands, right? If you go from the furthest north, you got Russian Kamchatka. This is bounded to the south by the Rat Islands, which are American, and to the east by Alaska. And then you have this chain of islands, which I believe are called the Kuril Islands, which go between Kamchatka and the island of Sakhalin. And the island of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands are Russian territory right now, but historically have belonged to Japan, and the Japanese generally call them the Northern Territories. And then immediately south of Sakhalin is Hokkaido, which is the northernmost Japanese island. Then you have Honshu, Kyushu, and I forget the name of the fourth Japanese island, so that's mainland Japan, or the four Japanese islands. And then you have various islands, Okinawa, you got Taiwan, you got the Philippines, and you get the tiny little atolls that you have basically a tug of war between the powers in the region. Taiwan, Philippines, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. And they're all having this sort of tug of war with the Chinese over who gets to own these islands, because just mastery of these islands is the key to to strangling Chinese maritime trade. You know, if you can set up this chain of islands and deny the Chinese access to the high seas, which it gives you a check on China. No matter what they do, they have to break through the chain of islands, and they've never been a maritime civilization. They're a hydrophobic civilization. They're really bad at... Hello, friendly dog. They're really bad at sea stuff, like sea shit. And so the hope is there that, you know, by seizing the Russian Far East, they can at least get... now Vladivostok is bounded by Japan, but they can maybe seize the Sea of Okhotsk, which freezes, but it's better than nothing. And if they get Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, they can actually move out into the world and go a ship, you know, go a pirating, go a Viking, you know, Chinese Vikings. And of course, gaining access to the Russian Far East will also, depending on how far north they go, they will also give them access to the Arctic. And of course, in the past, I've spoken about how the Arctic is now going to become one of the most interesting areas on the planet in terms of this just the geopolitical tug of war. Hey, I gotta get the sun out of my camera. Anyway, so what was I going? So we have this sort of situation where the Russians are weakening, all of their army is in Ukraine, and they're losing badly, if I may add so myself, but they are being rescued from the brink by their man in the White House. So the Chinese, who plan to essentially vassalize the Russians after the Russians bled themselves white in Ukraine, and I mean the Chinese already have done so in the economic realm, for better or worse. Now you've got the situation where, you know, America, the West, whatever, it's going to rescue Russia from the consequences of its own stupidity for the 5th or 6th time. I don't know, it's difficult to keep track of all these times where an Anglo-American power has rescued the Russians from their own stupidity. And so I guess Lao Wai is right. This puts the Chinese in a position where either we act now while the Russians are weak and the alliance with the Americans is still not in place, or we forever lose the ability to break out of the chain of islands encirclement. So now we get to the recommendations part of the video. So if any of you have the number of the Japanese Prime Minister, please send them this video. What needs to happen is, because Russia is right now too weak to deter a Chinese invasion, but it's also too weak to deter a Japanese invasion. What needs to happen is that Japan needs to amend its constitution to either allow its army to act abroad and seize territory, or it needs to constitutionally declare Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands as part of Japanese territory and therefore under the purview of the Japanese self-defense forces. And then, as soon as they notice, you know, the troops massing on the Russo-Chinese border, you know, the Chinese massing on the Russo-Chinese border, they should immediately take steps to seize Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, and therefore complete the chain, complete the first island chain's northern links, and once again check the Chinese and keep them bottled up on the continent, keep them away from the high seas, you know. And this would not only be good for Japanese geopolitical interests, it should also be good for the environment, and it should also be good for the world, because China is a cancer in the world, and ideally we would apply some very strong radiation and chemotherapy there, but we don't live in an ideal world, and China is going to keep being a problem because, well, we just don't have the stomach for chemotherapy, I guess. And that's what the Japanese should do, and we should definitely support them. And ideally, they can get over their historical problems with the Koreans so that the Koreans will also support them in this endeavor. The Koreans are actually very good at sea. They have a very good navy. So they should also get in on that, sort of help the Japanese as a gesture of goodwill, and then the Japanese can help them with the well, the bad Koreans. And then what should Europe do? Well, Europe should have also already have the plans to do so. But in the event that the Chinese move on the Russian Far East, then I suggest that a coalition of Nordic and Baltic states, along with Poland, so Norway, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, they actually jump into the Ukrainian fray and rush to capture as much of European Russia as possible, ideally to the Ural Mountains and the Volga, but also the far north, as much of the Russian Arctic coast as possible, you know, possibly just an archipelago of port cities and just the outlying islands. But it's imperative that China not be allowed to break its confinement by seizing Russian territory and gaining access to the world oceans, because we have enough problems dealing with the Chinese right now when they're nice and bottled. What do you think is going to happen when they're going to be unleashed on the world? Anyways, that's my recommendations. You know, if any one of you are in contact with the relevant governments, please let them know that there's an eccentric YouTuber out there who's recommending that they invade Russia and partition it among themselves, and I'm sure they'll take you up on it. Bye bye, people, and take care.